Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really groundbreaking promise that was made in the world of humanitarian aid. And we're going to dig into a report that asks a pretty tough question. Years later, has that promise actually been kept? Okay, so before we go any further, let's get on the same page with one key term you're going to hear a lot: localization. At its heart, it's a really simple but incredibly powerful idea. It's all about shifting the power and, most importantly, the money to the local experts who are right there on the front lines of any crisis. So, this whole story really kicks off back in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit. This was a huge deal. You had global leaders and major aid organizations all coming together to sign this landmark agreement called the Grand Bargain. And the whole goal was to make aid smarter, faster, and just better. And that brings us to our first section. We're going to look at the promise itself. What exactly was this commitment that was supposed to fundamentally change the way humanitarian aid works? Well, the absolute core of the Grand Bargain came down to this one single number: 25%. The people who signed it promised to provide a full quarter of all humanitarian funding directly to local and national responders, and they even set a deadline for themselves, the year 2020. And the thinking behind it just makes so much sense, right? Get more resources directly into the hands of the people who know their own communities, their culture, their needs better than anyone else possibly could. I mean, these are the folks who are always the first to respond when disaster strikes and the very last to leave. Okay, so that was the big, shiny promise. But what about the reality? How's it all playing out on the ground? Well, a study commissioned by the NEAR Network decided to find out, to really investigate if this 25% goal was being met in a couple of the world's biggest humanitarian crises. The report really zeroed in on Somalia and South Sudan back in 2017. And the researchers set out to do something that's surprisingly difficult: to actually follow the money, to track it meticulously, from the big international donors all the way down the chain, to see where it landed. Now just take a look at what they found in Somalia. This chart tells a huge story. You can see how the money flows. More than half of it went to UN agencies, another big chunk to international NGOs, and then look down there at that tiny, tiny sliver, 1.7%. That's what made it directly to local groups. When the researchers finished their calculations for both countries, the final number just revealed this staggering gap. In the end, they found that only about 4% of the total funding went directly to local and national actors, not the promised 25%, just 4. So this just begs a massive question, right? If the money isn't going directly to local groups like everyone agreed it should, then where is it going, and why is the journey so complicated? What the report discovered is that the vast majority of funding flows through these big international bodies. The UN, large international NGOs, they effectively act as middlemen. And as you can see from this quote, for the local groups on the ground, this layer feels less like a partner and a lot more like a gatekeeper that's controlling all the access. In this system, it basically creates two completely different worlds. On the one hand, when direct funding does happen, it builds trust, it's efficient, it empowers local leaders. But the current system, the indirect one, often just creates mountains of paperwork and reinforces these old power imbalances, where the local experts end up being treated more like subcontractors than actual partners. So you have to ask yourself, why? Why does this middleman system, which is so clearly falling short of that 25% goal, continue to be the main way of doing business? Well, the report points to a few major reasons. First, you've got the big donors. They tend to be pretty risk-averse, so they prefer to write one massive check to a big, famous organization they already know. Plus, the business models of these large international agencies actually depend on them managing these huge pots of money. And then there's this perception, which is often unproven, that local groups just don't have the capacity to handle the big grants. But here's the really important part. The study doesn't just point out all the problems and leave it there. It actually offers a really clear practical set of solutions for how to close this gap between the promise and the reality on the ground. And the recommendations are all focused on really tangible actions. First off, let's just get better at tracking the money so we actually have real data. Then, provide more flexible core funding that lets local groups build their own systems instead of dictating every little thing. And finally, let's help them team up to form their own groups or consortia so they can manage larger grants together and make better use of pooled funds, which are already proven to be way more accessible for them. And it's so important to remember where this push for change is coming from. This entire evidence-based report was driven by networks like NEAR. These are global movements made up of the very local and national organizations who are on the front lines, advocating for a bigger voice and ultimately more control over the resources meant to help their own communities. Which brings us to the final, really crucial question. This report and others like it make it crystal clear that the path to fulfilling the grand bargain's promise is right there. The steps are known. The question really isn't how anymore, it's when. Is the political will finally there to make this fundamental, common sense change actually happen?